Hey, it's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. And what we've been trying to do is give you an overview of some of the things that you need to be looking out for and some of the things you need to know when it comes to taking the state test in U.S. history. Today we're going to pick up with lesson number 10, and it's the second part of the lesson. What we try to do in this particular case is give you some ideas about what some of the test items that have been given regarding, Standard 11, the Civil Rights Movement. And what we're trying to do, of course, is give you some familiarity with some of the types of questions that you might see. And we'll start by looking at some of those questions and walk you through what some of the possible answers, of course, could be. What was the significance of Executive Order 9981, which was issued by President Harry Truman in 1948, ending racial segregation in the United States industry was a step toward racial integration in other areas of American society. Ending segregation of the U.S. military was a step toward racial integration in other areas of American society. Ending racial segregation in public education allowed all American children to receive a high-quality education regardless of race. Or D, racial segregation of public places allowed all Americans to enjoy equal access to theaters, restaurants, and hotels regardless of race. Well, Executive Order 9981, issued by Truman, is one of the things that was in your fact list. And the best answer it had to do, of course, with desegregating the military. So the best answer would be B, ending racial segregation in the military as being a step toward racial integration. All right, this excerpt comes from the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education, case decided on May 17, 1954. And what we already know about Brown, based on what we did in the overview and what we know from the fact list, is that what it did, of course, is it ended separate but equal doctrine, which statement describes the result of the Brown v. Board Education statement. And once again, if we know what Brown does, this doesn't matter so much. And we can answer this question with even not having to worry about the 14th Amendment here in this particular case. The process for integration of public school was initiated. Students were given the option to choose which public schools to attend. Well, they have anything to do with that. The mandate for separate but comparable schools was put in place. Nope. If that was anything, that was set a plessy, if anything. Citizens were asked to vote on whether to integrate public schools in their district. Had nothing to do with that. The best answer was A, the process for integration of the public schools. And I could answer that question without having to read that. In some cases, it may not be a bad idea or bad strategy to see if you can answer the question even without having to look at the graphic that they give you there. Which civil rights group from its earliest days used as any means necessary to protect itself in an effort to achieve racial equality? The Black Panther Party, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, National Association for Advancement of Colored People. Well, if you think about it, we have some clues here. Christian, nonviolent. Does that sound like Christian? Does that sound like nonviolent? I probably could just eliminate them based on just some common sense. But even if I had no common sense, if I'd go back to what the overview tells me, and if I go back and look at what's already initiated in the fact list, I'll know very simply that the one thing up here that had to do with meeting violence with violence would be the Black Panther Party. And that's your best answer in this case. This excerpt comes from an official government document issued in 1948. From which document does this excerpt come? The majority opinion in Plessy v. Ferguson, the majority opinion in Brown v. Board of Education. Well, Plessy was 1896, the majority of Brown v. Education, 1954. So I've already eliminated some of my options here. President Harry S. Truman's Executive Order 9981, and Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. Well, all I do is go to my fact list or go to my overview again. Why did the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee direct many of its efforts toward registering voters in the South? SNCC understood that it needed registered votes to obtain equal pay for women. Was SNCC about getting equal pay for women? SNCC knew that registered voters were needed to increase its political power and affect change. SNCC hoped to encourage voters to support the Republican Party so that federal power would be limited. SNCC wanted to pass the 26th Amendment so that younger people could vote and change society for the better. Well, it didn't have anything to do with that. The best answer is that registered voters were needed to increase the political power and effect change. This excerpt comes from Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Once again, we're going to try to attempt to answer this without having to look at the graphic. which statement represents a long-term effect of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. With the Voting Rights Act, the purpose of it was to make sure that African Americans, in this case, and any American really, that they wouldn't be discriminated against or have their right to vote, of course, limited. So African Americans gained electoral power, number of majority political parties increased, and having anything to do with increasing the number of political parties. The number of federal state elections didn't have anything to do with increasing elections. African Americans became the largest, nope, not even the majority African Americans aren't. So the best answer is African Americans gained electoral power. Once again, you can answer these questions in most cases without having to engage with these. That don't mean that you shouldn't read them, but sometimes I would just look and see what I know, and then if I need some help, I'll refer it up there. This chart shows African American voter registration rates by percentage for elections held in southern states from 1965 and 1988. Well, with the Voting Rights Act, I know that voting rights, of course, was expanded. So that means that in these southern states, the number of people voting, or the percentage of people voting, should be going up every year. In 65 in Alabama, it's 19 to 68. Let's go down to Mississippi. In Mississippi was 6.7% of African Americans voting, but by 1988, 74% of African Americans are voting. So more and more African Americans, of course, are being able to vote. So the change in African American voter registration rates between 65 and 88 was prompted by executive order by FDR. Nope. It's dead and gone by that time. Civil rights legislation was signed by LBJ. Anti-war sentiment during Richard Nixon's administration. Anti-war sentiment? What the what? Judicial decisions during Dwight Eisenhower's administration? Best answer, Voting Rights Act was signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. Come on, Voting Rights Act. Once again, if you know the facts, you'll be in good shape. But if you don't know the facts, you're in trouble. This map shows the route of an event that occurred in Alabama in 1965. Okay, so Selma, I already know a little bit about what happens, of course, in Selma. Which piece of legislation was passed in part as a result of the event representing the map? Well, I know the Selma March was about voting rights. Yeah. Ain't hard if you know stuff. So you gotta learn those facts. These events occurred during the Civil Rights Movement. 55, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the Montgomery bus to a white man. In 1960, African Americans staged a sit-in at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. led a march from Selma, Alabama. How did these events influence the tactics used by other minority groups? They revealed the effectiveness of economic boycotts. Okay? They revealed the effectiveness of continued harassment. They demonstrated the effectiveness of voter registration. They demonstrated the effectiveness of civil disobedience. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, that means she was breaking the law. When African Americans staged a sit-in at a lunch counter, they were breaking the law. 65, Martin Luther King Jr. led a march from Selma, Alabama. All of these things had one thing in common, is that they were effecting change by rejecting the status quo or what the established norms was. And that is what we call civil disobedience. And that's the best answer. What we try to do is to give you some ideas about some of the types of questions that you will see when it comes to the state test. Now keep in mind, I keep harping on this. The best way to do well when it comes to the test is to have a great baseline knowledge in terms of what happens in our history. And if you have a good baseline knowledge of what happens, you'll be in good shape. And then if you can keep time frames and kind of remember when things kind of happen, that's a great benefit to you. But now, we told you what you need to do, and that's get a great baseline knowledge. We showed you how you can get a great baseline knowledge by using the flashcards and stuff like that. If you expect to do well, please take advantage of some of the things that we've told you. This is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. And with that, we'll see you next time.